Hello and welcome to the WIHS Journal, Public Affairs from 104.9 FM. I'm Paul Kretschmer. Everyone knows that President Donald Trump is on trial before the U.S. Senate for crimes which are described in the paperwork as high crimes and misdemeanors. The House of Representatives impeaches or indicts a president, and then the Senate conducts the trial to determine whether the president will be removed from office. On today and tomorrow's broadcast, we'll be listening to attorney and University of New Haven professor Michael Lawlor, a former state legislator, talk about the impeachment trial and how it differs significantly from the normal criminal trial or civil trial that most people are used to, either because they've been there before or because they've seen it on television as portrayed.
Well, it's a great question, and there's a huge difference. As you may know, I was involved in the impeachment investigation. I was on the committee investigating former Governor Rowland as part of an impeachment process. And because of that, I learned an awful lot about how these things are supposed to work and what they really are and what they are not. And so it's not like a criminal trial. Because don't forget, in a criminal trial, it's about whether or not a person did something in the past and how much should they be punished if they did such a thing, right? The impeachment process is really a political solution to a very real problem. In other words, if there seems to be a consensus that the chief executive officer, in this case the president, needs to be removed from office for the protection of the government, for the integrity of the government, then this is the mechanism by which it happens in our country. In other countries, the same thing is accomplished, but there they would call it a vote of no confidence in a parliamentary system. So in other words, a prime minister could be removed from office by a vote of the parliament. And so this is our mechanism available for that. So what I think is happening now in the Senate is, the first question is, was the president involved in some misconduct? And the second question is, if you think he was, is it so serious? Does it so undermine the legitimacy, the credibility of the U.S. government, its ability to actually function, that he needs to be removed from that office for the protection of the government, of the country? And they don't have any ability to punish him. The only question before them is, should he or should he not be removed from office? Once he leaves office, if he has actually committed a crime, then he can be prosecuted in the criminal courts like anybody else. But this is only a question of should the Congress remove a sitting president based on basically a danger to the nation. And I mentioned a couple of other interesting differences. In a way, the Senate is sitting as a jury right now. But it's not like jury duty in a trial, because if it's jury duty in a trial, for starters, you're not really allowed to look at any information other than what's actually presented by the lawyers in the courtroom. Here, elected members of the U.S. Senate presumably know an awful lot about what's alleged. They're certainly not prohibited from going out and talking to their constituents or to their colleagues or getting information on their own. At the end of the day, they have to cast a vote, but they're not bound by the same kinds of rules that typically apply to jurors. Another thing that's really different is that there's no burden of proof or anything like that. In a criminal case, the government has to prove the charges beyond a reasonable doubt. There's nothing like that in an impeachment proceeding. It's just a question of, does each senator feel he should be removed from office or not? That's basically what it boils down to. And whatever gets them to that opinion is constitutionally sufficient. This was basically designed by Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah.
When the Constitution was drafted, and the whole point was basically in case of emergency, this is the option to protect the country, and so it's a political thing, not a legal or sort of judicial thing that's happening.
As far as the proceedings are going, does that leave it then up to the membership of the House of Representatives on the one hand to determine what they feel a reasonable burden of proof is, and then the Senate's job to decide whether or not they agree with that or have their own level of burden of proof in order to determine individually whether they'll vote or not one way or the other?
Well, sort of. The analogy in the criminal process is that the House of Representatives plays the role of a grand jury, whether or not to bring the charges in the first place. And in a criminal case, a grand jury is there probable cause to believe this person committed a crime, and do you think he should be prosecuted for it? That's what a grand jury does, and that's basically what the House of Representatives did. But it's turned over to the Senate to decide, okay, is this so bad? I mean, A, do you think it happened? And B, if it did happen, does he need to be removed from office? And so let's make an analogy. Let's say President Trump or any other president got caught, I don't know, selling drugs or stealing a car or something. I mean, those are crimes, and they're serious crimes. Mm-hmm. But does it really have anything to do with his ability to govern the country? You know, and I think if you think back to President Clinton's impeachment proceedings, I mean, what he did was pretty outrageous. I don't think anyone would argue that point in terms of having a sexual affair with one of his interns and then lying about it under oath. I mean, that's pretty bad stuff, but it doesn't really get directly to his ability to govern. And I think for that reason, he wasn't actually removed. He was impeached, but not removed from office. With President Trump, you know, I know people can disagree about this, but the issue is here is the national security of the country at risk because, allegedly at least, President Trump is trying to get a foreign government to do something solely to help him in an election. And the government we're talking about is the government of Ukraine, which is in a very fragile place. You know, there's a shooting war going on right now there with Russians and Russian surrogates. And it's a very fragile democracy. And it's really sort of the linchpin of stability in that part of the world. You know, coincidentally, when I was in college and grad school, I studied East European and Soviet politics, and I've actually visited Ukraine. I actually did my master's thesis on Ukrainian nationalism. So I have a soft spot in my heart sort of cheering for Ukrainians as they try and put together a stable democracy. And now they're caught in the middle of this drama. It's really all about U.S. politics and Kremlin politics. And it's, you know, unfortunately, there's nothing they can do to get out of it. But but the outcome of the situation in Ukraine will have a big impact on our own national security and that of our allied countries like Poland and the Baltic states. And, you know, history tells us that if things get out of control in that part of the world, you could easily end up in a world war. And so that's why this is so dangerous, assuming it's all true.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier Hamilton's key influence on the way the portion of the Constitution was written dealing with impeachment and removal from office. Are you aware, based upon your study or previous impeachment work, what kind of influences were at work with Alexander Hamilton as he drafted that?
Well, I mean, he wasn't the only one. I mean, they obviously debated it in the Constitutional Convention and ratified it. But, you know, the concern at the time, if you think back in American history, we had just fought a revolution against the king, you know. Yeah. And I think in his mind, it's like, what would happen here if all of a sudden the president started to act like a king? In other words, the laws don't apply to me. I don't have to listen to anybody. You know, they carefully designed the balance of powers, you know, the judicial branch, the legislative branch, the presidency. And they did it in such a way that the other two can have a check on the third. And you know, obviously one of the controversies in Washington right now is the suggestion, you know, it's apparent to me at least, that you know, President Trump is basically disregarding a lot of conventions that have been honored by Democrats and Republicans and presidents forever in this country, you know, ignoring subpoenas, saying that Article 2 of the Constitution says I can do anything I want. I mean, that kind of stuff is really unprecedented in this country, and it's kind of like acting like a king. And that's why I think people in the impeachment proceeding are arguing that this is the kind of situation that Hamilton and the other authors of the Constitution were worried about when they crafted the impeachment mechanism. So, I mean, people could disagree about what to make of it, but that's essentially what I think was intended 200 plus years ago.
This has been part one of a two-part conversation with attorney Michael Lawlor, a professor at the University of New Haven. For further information, call us at 860-346-1049 or visit WIHS 1049 for selected programs from the Journal series. The opinions expressed are those of the participants, not necessarily those of the staff or management of the station. I'm Paul Kretschmer on the WIHS Journal, Public Affairs from WIHS, Middletown.